Most organizations still talk about AI like it's a faster stapler, a productivity tool, a feature you enable. That story is comforting and it's wrong. Work now happens through AI, with AI, and because of AI, drafting, summarizing, prioritizing, and quietly deciding what counts as reality. That makes humans more important, not less, because judgment, context, and accountability don't automate. In the next few minutes, this gets reduced to a simple model. Collaboration has structural, cognitive, and experiential layers, and AI rewires all three. The foundational misunderstanding: deploy Copilot as a feature toggle. The foundational mistake is treating Copilot like a license assignment and a change management email. Copilot is not a tool inside Word. It is a participant inside the system that produces your organization's decisions. That distinction matters because the moment AI starts drafting your work, summarizing your meetings, and suggesting your next actions, you've changed the shape of collaboration, not cosmetically, mechanically. Most leaders still think the adoption plan is enable Copilot, train prompts, publish a few do's and don'ts, and then measure whether people use it. That's feature rollout logic. And feature rollout logic fails when the feature becomes the narrator of the work. Because AI doesn't just increase output, it changes what gets noticed. When Copilot summarizes a meeting, it compresses a messy hour into a tidy paragraph. When it drafts a proposal, it chooses a structure before your team argues about the problem. When it suggests action items, it decides what was important enough to become work. That's not assistance, that's framing. And framing is where power lives. So the actual problem isn't, are people using Copilot? Yeah. The problem is, what decisions are now being routed through an AI-generated first draft of reality? This is where organizational entropy shows up. Policies drift, ownership blurs, people take shortcuts, and every shortcut becomes an entropy generator. Small exceptions that accumulate until you can no longer tell what the organization believes, only what it has allowed. In practice, the deploy Copilot mindset creates three predictable failures. First, invisible co-authorship. Someone drops a clean, confident draft into a channel. The team edits it, the deck ships, nobody says how it was produced. Now you have an artifact with unclear provenance and unclear accountability. If it's wrong, who owns the error? The person who clicked generate, the person who edited a sentence, or the leader who forwarded it with looks good? This is not a philosophical question, it's an incident review question. Second, speed up, coherence down. AI removes friction from producing text, so teams produce more. But friction wasn't only waste. Friction was often the forcing function that made people explain their assumptions to each other. When the draft appears instantly, the team skips the shared sense-making that used to happen while building it. The result is fast alignment on words and shallow alignment on meaning. You'll see it later as rework, decision reversals, and a strange kind of collective amnesia. I thought we agreed on this, followed by 5 people realizing they agreed on different interpretations of the same summary. Third, ownership migration. When Copilot becomes the default first writer, humans quietly move from authors to reviewers. Review feels efficient. It is also cognitively lazy. Editing a draft is not the same as constructing the model of the problem in your head. Review optimizes for polish. Authorship optimizes for understanding. Over time, if you don't design against it, the organization stops building shared mental models. It starts consuming outputs. That's epistemic agency loss. In plain language, the team no longer owns how it knows. Now, none of this means don't use Copilot. It means stop pretending it's a neutral productivity upgrade. It is a sociotechnical redesign. The system behavior changes whether you planned for it or not. And if you want the cynical architectural truth, you are already redesigning your organization. You're just doing it accidentally. So the executive question becomes simple. What kind of collaborators are you creating when AI is always in the room? That question forces a better definition of collaboration. Collaboration is not meetings and chat threads. Collaboration is the system your organization uses to turn partial information into decisions. Who contributes? What gets recorded, what gets ignored, how disagreement is handled, and who is accountable when it goes wrong. Once AI becomes a participant, it affects every step of that pipeline. It accelerates production, it compresses debate, it standardizes language, it makes outputs look finished earlier than they are. And humans don't become obsolete. They become the control plane. Humans still have to decide what matters, what trade-offs are acceptable, what risks are real, and what context changes the meaning of the same facts. AI can propose, it can summarize, it can imitate certainty, it cannot be accountable. So before we talk about features, licensing, or prompt libraries, the correct move is to map the collaboration system itself. That's why the rest of this episode uses a 3-layer model: structural, cognitive, experiential, because if you only manage the surface layer, you get accidental, culture, and conditional chaos. And once AI is a participant, accidental culture is not a rounding error. It's the default, the 3-layer model: structural, cognitive, experiential collaboration. Here's the model that keeps this from turning into another AI changes everything monologue. Collaboration has 3 layers: structural, cognitive, and experiential. Most organizations only manage the structural layer because it's visible, schedulable, and reportable. Meetings, chat, documents, workflows, who's invited, where the files live, which channel is official. It feels like collaboration because it's where collaboration happens. But structurally correct work can still be cognitively wrong, and cognitively correct work can still fail if the human experience layer collapses. That distinction matters because AI touches all three layers at once. If you treat it like a productivity add-on, you'll optimize one layer, usually structural speed, and then act surprised when judgment, trust, and decision quality degrade. Start with the structural layer. Structural collaboration is the physical plumbing of work, the meeting cadence, the chat topology, the document lifecycle, the async versus sync balance, the workflow paths, the handoffs, the where does this live rules. It's also the implicit rules. If something is in email, it's formal. If it's in chat, it's provisional. If it's in a document, it's policy. Those conventions already determine who participates and what gets remembered. AI doesn't just make this faster, it turns the plumbing into an output generator. Meetings become transcripts, recaps, tasks, and artifacts. Chat becomes draft first. Documents become the battleground where the final version appears early and the team edits around it. Structurally, you get more artifacts, more traceability, and more motion. That's the easy part to see. Now, the cognitive layer. Cognitive collaboration is what teams do to turn ambiguity into action. Sense-making, ideation, synthesis, trade-off decisions, risk framing, and the building of shared mental models. It's the part nobody can point to on a calendar invite, but it's the part that makes the calendar invite worth having. AI accelerates cognitive work by reducing search cost and offering synthesis. It also degrades cognitive work by making incomplete framing look complete. The moment the team treats an AI summary as the truth instead of a compression, it stops doing the cognitive labor that creates understanding. You get faster convergence, but you lose the thing that prevents dumb decisions. Disagreement grounded in different models of reality. This is where work graph and work IQ become leverage. In Microsoft terms, graph is the organizational memory of people, artifacts, and activity signals across Microsoft 365. Work IQ is essentially the intelligence layer built on top of that. Access plus memory plus inference. It's how Copilot stops being generic and starts being contextually dangerous. Because when the system has context, it can route work more effectively. And when it routes work more effectively, humans are tempted to stop thinking about why it routed it that way. So the cognitive layer is not use Copilot to brainstorm. The cognitive layer is preserve epistemic agency. Keep humans directing how the organization knows, not just what it produces. Now the experiential layer. This is the part leaders like to treat as soft, which is why it keeps detonating projects. Experiential collaboration is psychological safety, autonomy, identity, authorship, and meaning. It's how it feels to contribute, disagree, and be accountable. It determines whether people speak up when something is wrong, whether they challenge an AI-generated summary, and whether they feel like the work is theirs or just something they edited. AI changes the experience in subtle ways. It shifts status dynamics. It changes who speaks first. It makes critique feel like obstruction. It makes people worry they're arguing with the machine, not debating a draft. And once people feel that, silence becomes the path of least resistance. That's not culture, that's system behavior. And leadership has an obligation here, either design across all three layers or accept accidental outcomes. Structural drift is measurable. Cognitive drift looks like alignment. Experiential drift looks like engagement is fine until retention and quality collapse. So we start with the three-layer model because it forces a practical question. When AI is a participant, where is the failure actually happening? And the answer is usually not where you're looking. Structural. Meetings become artifacts, not events. Meetings used to be a temporary event. People talked, somebody took notes, and the real outcome lived in whoever remembered the argument afterward. That world is gone. In the AI-mediated workplace, the meeting is no longer the product. The artifact is. Transcript, recap, decisions, tasks, follow-ups, and whatever gets forwarded to someone who wasn't there. That's the new unit of work. And structurally, this seems like an upgrade. Less ambiguity, more traceability, fewer. What did we decide? Emails. Leadership loves it because it looks like maturity. Everything captured, everything searchable, everything packaged. But here's what most people miss. The artifact doesn't just record the meeting, it replaces the meeting as the organization's memory. Once you have a recap, people stop asking humans. They ask the recap, they forward the recap, they build the next deck from the recap, and the recap becomes the truth through repetition, not because it's accurate. That distinction matters. A transcript is raw. A recap is interpreted. It's a compression algorithm applied to social reality. And any compression loses information, tone, hesitation, uncertainty. The moment someone said, "I don't know," the implicit risks people were nervous to name. AI is great at removing that mess. It is also great at removing the evidence that the room wasn't actually aligned. So the structural change is straightforward. Attendance becomes optional, but documentation becomes mandatory. People follow meetings instead of joining them. They show up for the last 5 minutes and rely on the recap to tell them what happened. They trust the artifact more than the conversation because the artifact is tidy. The organization shifts from presence-based work to artifact-based work. Now, on paper, this sounds efficient. In practice, it has a specific failure mode. Meeting quality declines while documentation improves. Because once you believe the artifact is the real output, the incentives change. People stop fighting for clarity in the room. They assume the recap will sort it out. They stop restating decisions out loud because it'll be in the notes. They stop doing the slow, annoying work of checking shared understanding because the system will generate a neat paragraph that looks like shared understanding. But that neat paragraph can be wrong in two ways, commission and omission. Commission errors. It states something confidently that the room did not decide. It turns a suggestion into a commitment. It converts a tentative "we should explore" into "we will do." That's not malicious. That's how summarization works when the input is messy. Omission errors, it excludes the debate that mattered. It omits the minority view, the risk caveat, the constraint, the uncomfortable dependency. And once omitted, it doesn't exist in the organizational narrative unless a human reinserts it. That's why meetings become artifacts is not neutral. It relocates power to whoever controls the artifact, not the senior person in the room. The person who edits the recap, the person who decides whether to accept the AI summary as is or rewrite it, the person who forwards it to leadership with one sentence of framing. And once you see that, you stop treating meeting recap as a convenience feature. It becomes governance, because the meeting artifact is now a control plane object. It is the object that propagates decisions through the organization. It gets indexed, it gets quoted, it gets embedded into the next document. It becomes the input to Copilot when someone asks, "What's the plan?" So if you don't design rules around artifacts, you don't have meeting hygiene. You have narrative drift. A useful norm here is brutal and simple. Recap is input, not truth. The recap must point to decisions, owners, and assumptions, not just highlights. If the team can't name what was decided, what was deferred, and what is explicitly uncertain, the meeting didn't produce a decision. It produced noise with better formatting. And for high-impact work, the artifact needs an accountable human signature, not as bureaucracy, as physics. Because the organization will treat that artifact as reality whether you intended it or not. This is the uncomfortable truth. AI didn't just make meetings easier to survive. It turned meetings into a publishing pipeline. And once you're publishing, you're governing. Structural chat shifts from dialogue to confirmation. Once meetings become artifacts, chat becomes the glue that pretends everything is aligned. That's always been true in teams. The difference now is that Copilot turns chat from a place where people think out loud into a place where people approve what already looks finished. Before AI, chat had friction. Someone typed a messy thought, got corrected, asked a question, rephrased, and eventually the thread converged. It wasn't pretty, but it forced the team to expose assumptions in public. The work happened in the gaps. The clarifying questions, the "wait, what do you mean?" the annoying back and forth that makes shared understanding real. Copilot changes who speaks first, because the person with the prompt can post a clean paragraph in 30 seconds, and the rest of the team is now reacting to something that looks like a conclusion. The default response is no longer exploration. It's approval, minor edits, or silence. This is not because people got lazy. It's because structure drives behavior. And when the first message is polished, disagreement feels like slowing down, not improving the work. Here's what most people miss. Chat isn't a conversation layer anymore. It's an authorization layer. Threads compress. People stop asking questions because questions now look like incompetence. Or worse, they look like resistance to efficiency. Instead of "what are we optimizing for?" you get LGTM. Instead of "what are the trade-offs?" you get a thumbs-up reaction. And the organization mistakes that for alignment. It's alignment on text, not alignment on meaning. This is where accountability starts to blur in a very specific way. Authorship becomes untraceable. In a draft-first world, you can usually point to the author. In a Copilot-first world, you can point to the messenger. Those are not the same thing. The person who posted the message may not have written it, may not understand it, and may not agree with the implications. They may simply be the one who could get a coherent paragraph out of the system fastest. So you get a new role in the organization, the prompt holder. Not the subject matter expert, not the accountable owner, the prompt holder. The person who can reliably produce good enough language that the team can ship. Over time, that shifts power, quietly, because whoever controls the first draft controls the range of debate. If the first draft frames the problem as "we need to reduce cost," the thread will debate cost reduction. If it frames it as "we need to reduce risk," the thread will debate controls. That initial frame becomes the rails. Most people won't jump the rails because the rails look reasonable and the chat wants closure. This might seem backwards, but the fastest way to suppress dissent is to make the proposal look complete. And Copilot is excellent at completeness. Now add another structural drift. Chat becomes the place where decisions get made without decision structure. People will say, well, if nobody objects by EOD, we'll proceed. That's a normal async pattern. But in an AI-mediated environment, the proposal that nobody objects to is often an AI-generated synthesis that feels authoritative. So silence becomes consent to the machine's framing, not consent to a human plan. And the moment you normalize that, you've created conditional chaos. Decisions that look documented but have no accountable reasoning behind them. This shows up later as conflict, not because people are irrational, but because they never built the same internal model of why the decision was made. They approved language, then discovered consequences. So what do? You don't ban Copilot in chat. You design for disagreement to survive polish. A simple norm: every proposal needs two alternatives, not because you love bureaucracy, because alternatives force the team to prove they considered option space, not just accepted the first coherent output. It also breaks authority bias by making it clear that the draft is a candidate, not a verdict. Another norm: separate generation from approval. If the person who generated the proposal is also the person asking for approval, you'll get compliance, not critique. The structure should make critique cheap. Here's the draft, here are the assumptions, here's what would change my mind. And finally, force ownership back into the thread, not thoughts, not please review. A named human owner who is accountable for the recommendation, including the parts Copilot wrote. If nobody is willing to sign their name to it, it isn't ready. Because chat is now where decisions get socialized at scale. And if chat becomes a confirmation engine, it will manufacture agreement faster than your organization can manufacture understanding. That's not collaboration, that's throughput disguised as consensus. Structural, draft-first collaboration becomes the default. Once chat becomes a confirmation layer, documents become the battlefield, because documents are where the organization pretends thinking happened. AI accelerates that pretense. The new default is draft-first collaboration. A good enough version appears instantly, and everyone moves into edit mode. Not because the team agreed the problem is understood. Because the artifact exists, and artifacts create gravity. The uncomfortable truth is that writing the first draft used to be the cognitive tax that paid for clarity. Someone had to decide what the problem was, what the structure should be, what evidence mattered, and what they were willing to claim. That process forced internal coherence before external polish. Copilot removes that tax. So the organization pays a different cost. It starts optimizing for refinement instead of reasoning. Editing is not thinking, it's post-processing. It can improve a document. It can also conceal that nobody actually formed a shared model of the problem. Here's what it looks like in real life. A strategy deck shows up with a clean narrative arc, headings that sound authoritative, and a set of recommendations that feel complete. The team spends an hour rearranging bullets, tightening language, and adding a chart. The deck is done. But the team never argued about what the deck should be true about. They argued about how it should sound. This is where coherence drops while throughput rises. And leaders love it at first because the pipeline feels faster. Fewer meetings, faster drafts, cleaner outputs. But the system behavior is different. The work has moved upstream into framing, and the framing just got outsourced to a probabilistic narrator. That distinction matters because the first draft sets the constraint boundaries. It decides what gets included as a category, what gets labeled as a risk, what becomes an assumption, and what never gets mentioned. And once the first draft exists, most teams won't rebuild it from scratch. They'll patch it. Patching feels efficient. Patching is also how technical debt accumulates. Draft-first collaboration produces cognitive debt the same way. Small omissions in problem framing that accumulate until you get a decision that looks rational but doesn't survive contact with reality. There's another structural side effect that leaders underestimate. Learning loops shorten. When people struggle through creating a structure, they learn the domain. They internalize the constraints. They develop conviction. When the draft arrives instantly, the struggle disappears, and so does the durable learning. You get speed without understanding. And in knowledge work, understanding is the asset. So the team becomes dependent on the artifact, not as a record, as a substitute for cognition. This is how epistemic agency loss begins structurally before it becomes a cultural problem. The organization stops building internal models and starts consuming external ones. Copilot becomes the default mechanism for starting. Humans become the mechanism for finishing. That sounds harmless until you realize what finishing work selects for: tone, formatting, and plausibility. Not truth, not trade-offs, not risk appetite. In other words, you can ship a beautifully edited hallucination. Now, this isn't a claim that Copilot always produces wrong content. It's a claim about what happens when the organization treats the first draft as the real start of thinking. It converts exploration into optimization, and optimization is only valuable after you pick the right objective function. Most teams never explicitly pick it. They inherit it from the draft. So the design response is not ban AI drafts. The response is to enforce intentional friction at the framing stage. A simple rule that works: no editing until the problem statement is human-authored and agreed. Not long, 2 paragraphs. What decision is being made, what constraints are real, what would make the recommendation unacceptable. If humans can't write that in plain language, the work isn't ready for drafting. It's ready for thinking. And then, when the draft exists, force the team to surface the hidden structure, assumptions, alternatives, and risks. Because AI loves to give you a single coherent story. Excellence requires the discipline to ask, what story did we not tell? That's the transition into the cognitive layer where Copilot stops being an assistant and becomes a co-author of how the organization thinks. Cognitive Copilot is a cognitive co-author, not an assistant. Okay, so basically, the moment Copilot writes the first coherent version of your idea, it's no longer helping you type. It is co-authoring your cognition. Most people hear that and assume it's philosophical. It isn't. It's mechanical. The system changes the order of operations. First, you struggled to form a model, then you wrote. Now you generate a model-shaped artifact, then you decide whether you agree with it. That swap sounds harmless until you ask what your organization is optimizing for. Copilot reduces search cost. It can pull relevant threads, summarize prior work, synthesize across documents, and propose structure faster than a human team can assemble it. In Microsoft's ecosystem, this works best when the system has access to organizational context: people, files, meetings, and activity signals. That's the work graph and work IQ story: access plus memory plus inference. And yes, that context makes outputs more relevant. It also makes the output feel like it knows. That's the weird part. Relevance reads like truth. When Copilot drafts a briefing that references last week's meeting, the current project plan, and the stakeholder email chain, it feels grounded, it feels authoritative. But what it's really doing is assembling a plausible narrative from available artifacts. It is not building conviction. It is not taking responsibility for omissions. It is not experiencing consequence. It is doing what a narrative engine does: compressing and completing. So the cognitive risk isn't that Copilot gives bad answers. The risk is that it gives good-sounding answers early enough that humans stop doing the cognitive labor that produces judgment. And in most organizations, judgment is the scarce resource. Here's the hidden role swap. Humans move from creators to reviewers. Reviewers are essential, but reviewers are also vulnerable. Review optimizes for, does this look reasonable? Not, is this the right framing of the problem? And the hardest errors in knowledge work are almost never spelling mistakes. They're framing mistakes. So you see a draft, you tweak the tone, you adjust a recommendation, you add a caveat, and you ship. Meanwhile, the underlying model, the assumptions, the trade-offs, the risk appetite was imported, not constructed. That's why Copilot as assistant is a comforting myth. In reality, it is something else, a cognitive co-author that proposes the mental scaffolding your team will stand on. Now, what remains human? This is where leaders need to stop talking about creativity in the abstract and start talking about governance. Humans' own meaning, humans' own trade-offs, humans' own ethical boundaries, humans' own risk tolerance, humans' own the final decision and the consequences when it goes wrong. That's not inspirational, that's liability. Copilot can produce options, it can suggest a structure, it can propose a narrative arc, it can make the document look complete, but it can't decide what you're willing to be wrong about. And it definitely can't decide what you're willing to be blamed for. So the value claim is precise. AI expands the option space only if humans keep steering. If humans stop steering, AI doesn't amplify intelligence. It amplifies momentum. It makes the organization faster at moving in whatever direction the first coherent draft implied. That's not excellence, that's just velocity. This is why Satya Nadella's decision framework's point matters, even outside software development. What the system needs is metacognition. Tools that help humans think about thinking, not tools that replace thinking with output. Because in an AI-mediated environment, the high-leverage work is not typing. It's asking, what are we optimizing, what are we assuming, and what would change our minds? If your teams don't do that explicitly, Copilot will do it implicitly. And implicit is where errors hide. So a practical executive lens is this: treat Copilot like an authorization compiler for narratives. It takes inputs, your documents, meetings, and chats, and produces an output that looks like a decision-ready artifact. But compilation is not comprehension. Compilation is not accountability. You still need humans to validate the model, not just the words. And the minute you accept that, the leadership job becomes clear. Protect cognition as a first-class asset. Design workflows where AI drafts are welcome, but human reasoning remains visible. Because if reasoning disappears, you don't get automation. You get unauditable organizational belief. And the next failure mode isn't wrong answer. It's that nobody can explain why the organization believed it in the first place. Cognitive authority bias, the AI suggested, becomes a veto. Here's where the real damage starts, and it looks like efficiency. Authority bias is the human habit of trusting an output because it looks confident, complete, and official. In the AI era, that bias gets a new uniform. Fluent language, clean structure, and the illusion of neutrality. You don't even need someone to say Microsoft recommends. The phrase Copilot says is enough to end a debate, because the output sounds like it already did the thinking. And humans are cognitively lazy in groups. They will accept a coherent narrative to avoid the cost of disagreement, especially when time is tight and everyone wants to look decisive. This is the uncomfortable truth. AI doesn't have to be right to become authoritative. It just has to be readable. Fluency is interpreted as competence. Completeness is interpreted as diligence. And a tidy summary is interpreted as consensus. That's how the AI suggested becomes a veto, not through explicit policy, but through social pressure. Disagreeing now feels like arguing with the system, not critiquing a draft. So people don't critique, they comply. There are two failure patterns that show up everywhere: commission errors and omission errors. Commission errors are the obvious ones. The model produces a recommendation that is wrong or incomplete or miscalibrated, and the team adopts it because it looks finished. The danger isn't the error. The danger is that nobody feels responsible for challenging it because the output arrived with the posture of certainty. The team says, well, it's probably fine. That sentence has killed more projects than budget cuts ever will. Omission errors are more subtle and more common. The AI output doesn't explicitly lie. It simply fails to include the alternatives, edge cases, or risks that a human would have surfaced if they were forced to reason from first principles. And because the output looks comprehensive, the team assumes the missing pieces don't exist. But they do exist. They just weren't retrieved or weren't prioritized or weren't present in the artifacts the model could see. In other words, the model didn't forget. It never knew. And the organization didn't notice because the paragraph looked complete. This is why authority bias is so corrosive in AI-mediated work. It makes absence look like irrelevance. And that's how debate dies. Nobody explains this right, but what gets suppressed isn't disagreement. It's epistemic work, the act of surfacing why you believe something, what evidence you're using, and what would falsify it. AI outputs skip that process by default. They deliver conclusions and leave the reasoning implicit. So the team stops asking the questions that create resilience. What are we assuming? What did we not consider? What would make this wrong? Instead, they ask a lower quality question. Does this look good? And looks good is a terrible standard for high-stakes work. This bias compounds inside Microsoft 365 because Copilot is not a random chatbot in a vacuum. It's grounded in your organization's artifacts. It references last week's meeting and the current deck and the email chain, so it feels like it has institutional authority. But this is the distinction that matters. Institutional memory is not institutional judgment. Work Graph and Work IQ can give Copilot more context. That improves relevance. It does not produce governance. It does not create accountability. It does not validate trade-offs. It just makes the narrative harder to challenge because now it feels like the organization said it. So you get a new social dynamic. The person challenging the output becomes the blocker. The person accepting it becomes the executor. In a culture that rewards speed, the executor wins. Over time, the organization trains itself to treat AI outputs as defaults and human critique as friction. That's backwards. And if you let it run, your decision quality becomes probabilistic. Not because the models are probabilistic, because your humans stopped behaving like reviewers of truth and started behaving like editors of plausibility. So what's the design move? You make authority explicit and you downgrade it on purpose. A simple norm, AI suggested, is never a justification, it's a starting point. If the recommendation matters, the human owner must restate the reasoning in their own words, with assumptions and trade-offs, and be willing to sign their name to it. Another norm, force alternatives, not 10. 2. If the team can't articulate two plausible paths, they didn't understand the problem. They just accepted the first narrative that compiled cleanly. And finally, you normalize critique of AI output as critique of a tool, not a person. Because if critique feels personal, the organization will choose silence. And silence is where authority bias becomes permanent. Once the AI suggested ends the conversation, you don't have augmented intelligence. You have automated consensus. An automated consensus is how smart organizations make dumb decisions faster. Cognitive epistemic agency loss, outsourcing how we know. Once authority bias takes hold, the next thing that erodes isn't productivity, it's epistemic agency. That's a clean term for something most leaders can feel but can't name. The organization stops owning how it knows. People stop directing the acquisition, testing, and justification of knowledge, and they start consuming conclusions that arrive prepackaged. In other words, the team still knows things, but it can't explain why. It can't show its work. It can't reliably defend the model behind the recommendation. That's not because people got stupid. It's because the system trained them to stop doing the hard part. AI makes knowledge ambient. And ambient knowledge is cheap until it becomes the foundation for a decision that has consequences. Here's what this looks like operationally. A leader asks, why are we doing this? And the answer is a paraphrase of a Copilot summary. Not malicious, not lazy, just normal. The person doesn't remember the original debate because they never formed a durable internal model of it. They remember the artifact, they remember the narrative. So the organization becomes a distributed recall system, and the humans become retrieval clients. That distinction matters because human judgment isn't just making a choice, it's holding an internal model of the world. Constraints, dependencies, risks, incentives, and the messy parts that never made it into the summary. If humans stop constructing those models, they can still approve decisions, but they can't anticipate second-order effects. They become fast and fragile. The counterintuitive part is that this happens even when the AI output is accurate, because the problem isn't correctness. The problem is cognitive ownership. When a team repeatedly starts with a generated draft, repeatedly accepts a generated recap, repeatedly uses AI to catch up, they stop practicing the mental labor that turns information into understanding. Working memory gets outsourced. Synthesis gets outsourced. Even curiosity gets outsourced because the machine is always ready with a plausible next step. Over time, the organization loses what it thinks it gained: speed. Because speed without internal models produces rework, and rework is just delayed cognition. This is the productivity paradox showing up at the cognitive layer. Efficiency rises, but coherence drops. The organization produces more artifacts per week, but fewer shared mental models per quarter. It feels like progress because motion is measurable, understanding isn't. Now put this inside Microsoft 365. The work graph is effectively the organization's memory of people, meetings, files, and activity signals. Work IQ builds an intelligence layer on top. Access, memory, inference. That's what allows Copilot to generate a briefing that feels like it's inside your business, not outside it. And when that works well, it's intoxicating. You stop searching, you stop asking people, you stop reading the raw sources, you stop rederiving context, you accept the synthesis. That's where epistemic agency dies. The organization no longer insists on primary artifacts, it insists on summaries. And summaries are not knowledge, they are a claim about knowledge. So the risk becomes specific, dependency on an unauditable narrator. Not unauditable because Microsoft didn't build logging. Unauditable because the human workflow stops preserving the reasoning traces that made the conclusion defensible. The system can show you what it cited, it can show you what it wrote. It cannot show you what the team believed, what the team rejected, and why. Those things live in human cognition, or they evaporate. This is why the leadership obligation is not teach better prompts. The obligation is to preserve epistemic agency as a design requirement. You have to build workflows where humans still do three things explicitly. First, direct inquiry. What are we trying to find out and what would count as evidence? Second, test claims. What assumptions are embedded in this narrative and what would falsify them? Third, own conclusions. Who is accountable for this decision and can they restate the reasoning without leaning on the AI suggested? If your organization can't do those three things, it's not an AI problem. It's a governance failure. And it gets worse in groups, because groups will always default to the path of least resistance. The least resistance path is accepting a clean narrative that reduces tension. It avoids conflict, it avoids embarrassment, it avoids the cost of being the person who says, I don't think we know that. But that cost is the price of excellence. So here's the line you want to remember. Copilot can accelerate knowledge work. It cannot replace epistemic responsibility. If you allow your organization to outsource how we know, you don't become modern. You become a high-throughput rumor mill with better formatting. And once that happens, every other control you think you have, policy, training, culture, becomes cosmetic. Because the organization's truth pipeline is now optimized for plausibility, not for understanding. That's the real risk. Cognitive work graph, work IQ, context becomes the product. Once epistemic agency starts eroding, leaders reach for a fix that sounds sensible. Fine, we'll improve the context. That's where work graph and work IQ enter the story. And yes, in Microsoft terms, graph is the organizational memory, people, meetings, chats, documents, relationships, and activity signals. Work IQ is the intelligence layer that sits on top. Access plus memory plus inference. It's what makes Copilot stop sounding generic and start sounding like it attended your meetings. But here's the architectural reality. Once context becomes machine-readable, context becomes the product. Not the spreadsheet, not the deck, not the transcript. The context. Because the value of an AI system in the enterprise isn't it can write. Any model can write. The differentiator is whether it can retrieve the right internal state, assemble the right narrative, and route the right next action without you spelling it out. That's what Work IQ is designed to do. And it changes what organizations fight over. In a pre-AI workplace, teams fought over outputs, whose deck, whose notes, whose decision memo, whose version is current. In an AI-mediated workplace, teams start fighting over the underlying context, which artifacts are visible, which are authoritative, which are tagged, which are discoverable, and which are buried in private chats and personal OneDrives, because the machine can only summarize what it can see. So the organization quietly shifts from write better to curate better, from produce to index, from share to shape. That distinction matters because curating context is power. If your project's artifacts are clean, well-linked, and consistently located, Copilot will make your project look coherent. If your work is fragmented, ambiguous, or scattered across informal channels, Copilot will make your project look incoherent. Not because reality changed, because visibility changed. So the work graph becomes a narrative engine and Work IQ becomes a narrative accelerator. which sounds fine until you remember narrative is not truth. Work IQ will infer, it will rank, it will prioritize, it will compress, it will act like a helpful librarian with a sense of urgency. And the organization will treat that ranking as an objective description of what matters because it's surfaced inside the flow of work. This is the danger. Inferred truth becomes operational truth. Someone asks Copilot, what's the status? And it responds with a crisp summary grounded in the latest email thread and the most recent doc edit. That answer will get forwarded, it will become the update, it will drive next steps, even if it missed the real blocker because the blocker lived in a hallway conversation, a side chat, or a meeting where nobody saved the decision log. So leaders think they are buying intelligence. They are buying a new dependency. The organization's ability to know becomes constrained by what the graph contains, which means the hard work is not deploying Copilot. It's engineering the organization's memory so it doesn't lie by omission. And that brings us back to why humans become irreplaceable. Humans are the only part of the system that can interpret context, not just retrieve it. A graph can tell you that two people met. It can't tell you that one of them left unconvinced. It can tell you a document was edited. It can't tell you the edit was political, not technical. It can show you that a decision was made. It can't tell you the decision was made under fatigue or under pressure or under false consensus created by a tidy summary. Work IQ gives you a relevance engine. Humans provide the meaning engine. So the executive move is to treat work graph like a control plane for collaboration. If you don't intentionally design where knowledge lives, how it's linked, and what counts as authoritative, the AI will still operate. It will just operate on accidental context. And accidental context produces conditional chaos, fast, plausible outputs that root the organization into the wrong decisions. This is why context engineering isn't a cute term, it's governance. You are deciding what the organization will remember, what it will forget, and what it will treat as reality. And there's one more uncomfortable consequence. Once context becomes the product, people will start optimizing for the graph. They will write for retrieval. They will perform clarity. They will over-document to be visible. They will shape artifacts to influence how Copilot summarizes them. That's not paranoia. That's rational behavior in a system where summaries move power. So if you want excellence, you don't just ask, is Copilot accurate? You ask, who controls the context that Copilot treats as truth? Because when AI is the narrator, whoever curates the narrative shapes the decision. And that is the next layer of erosion. Power dynamics. Whoever curates the narrative shapes the decision. So now the real game emerges, and it isn't technology, it's power. Not the theatrical kind, the quiet kind, who gets believed, who gets cited, and whose version becomes the starting point for the next decision. In AI-mediated collaboration, power shifts toward whoever curates the narrative. Not necessarily who knows the most, not necessarily who's highest in the org chart, the person who controls what gets captured, summarized, forwarded, and framed. Because the organization doesn't run on truth, it runs on the story that feels true enough to act on. Before AI, narrative control was expensive. You needed time to write the update. You needed status meetings to socialize it. You needed someone to take notes. You needed the political capital to tell the story and keep it consistent across conversations. Now, narrative control is cheap. A recap can be generated in seconds. A status update can be synthesized from 10 threads. A leadership brief can be created from a folder of documents. And because those artifacts look complete, they get treated like facts. This is the structural consequence of AI as participant. Information flow flattens and hardens at the same time. It flattens because a junior employee can generate a brief that would have taken a manager 2 hours. They can publish clarity on demand. They can route context across functions without waiting for hierarchy to package it. But it also hardens because once the artifact exists, it becomes the official story. It becomes searchable. It becomes quotable. It becomes the input to the next Copilot query. And the organization starts using it as a substitute for asking people what they meant. So you get new gatekeepers, not keepers in the old sense of withholding access, but in the new sense of selecting what counts as relevant. Prompt competence becomes influence. Curation competence becomes authority. Publishing competence becomes power. And it's not malicious, it's mechanical. If a person consistently produces clean summaries, leadership will rely on them. If a team consistently maintains a well-structured SharePoint site or a single canonical plan, Copilot will make them look coherent. Coherence becomes reputation, and reputation becomes influence. Meanwhile, the teams whose work is messy, ambiguous, or distributed across chat will look disorganized in the AI layer, even if the underlying work is strong. That's not fair, it's just how retrieval works. This is where leaders get surprised. They assume AI democratizes work. It does, but it also centralizes the narrative layer. Because the people who can shape the inputs and the artifacts that get treated as authoritative shape the outputs. And the outputs are what executives see, what gets actioned, and what becomes the organizational memory. So decision-making becomes more like media. Agenda control shifts to whoever decides what gets summarized and what gets ignored. A meeting recap can highlight risk, or it can highlight progress. A team's thread summary can include dissent, or it can compress dissent into a polite, "some concerns were raised." A project update can surface dependencies, or it can bury them under next steps. Same meeting, same facts, different narrative, and the organization will act on the narrative, not on the raw transcript that nobody reads. This is why recap is input, not truth, wasn't a cute norm. It was a governance requirement. Because once AI accelerates narrative production, the cost of rewriting reality drops and the incentives to do it rise. Now add the psychological piece. People feel this shift before they can describe it. They'll say things like, decisions are being made without us, or I don't recognize our work in that summary, or we keep getting surprised by what leadership thinks is happening. That's not drama. That's the lived experience of narrative drift. So the leadership risk is specific. Power shifts without governance, and the organization confuses that shift for progress because the artifacts look better. Excellence requires you to make narrative power visible. Who owns the recap? Who owns the decision log? Where is the canonical source of truth? What is the escalation path when the summary is wrong? And critically, who is accountable for the interpretation, not just the transcript? Because AI can capture, AI can synthesize, AI can draft, but accountability still lives with humans even when the humans pretend it doesn't. If you don't assign narrative ownership intentionally, it will self-assign to whoever is fastest, most fluent, or most proximate to leadership. And then you'll get a shadow hierarchy, not based on role, but on who controls the story. And once that exists, your culture problems won't announce themselves as power dynamics. They'll show up as human experience issues, psychological safety drops, ownership gets weird, and people disengage while output looks fine, which is exactly where this goes next. Experiential, psychological safety under AI, speak up changes shape. Once narrative control shifts, the first thing that breaks is not a process, it's voice. Psychological safety is the system property that determines whether people will say that summary is wrong, or that framing is dangerous, or we're missing the real constraint. In an AI-mediated workplace, speak up doesn't disappear. It mutates. It becomes more costly, more ambiguous, and easier to punish without anyone admitting they punished it. Before AI, challenging a person was socially risky, but at least the target was clear. You could disagree with Mark's interpretation of the meeting. You could argue with Sarah's proposal. You could ask for evidence. And the room understood the game. Humans disagree, humans negotiate. Now, the challenge often targets an artifact that looks official. A recap, a synthesized thread, a recommended next step. The output arrives with a calm, neutral tone, and that tone changes the social meaning of dissent. Critiquing it feels less like, I have a different view, and more like, I'm disputing reality. That distinction matters, because teams don't experience AI output as someone's draft. They experience it as the system speaking, and people have been trained for decades to treat systems as objective, so the psychological cost of disagreement rises even when the disagreement is correct. This is where the fear shifts. It's no longer only fear of being wrong in front of peers. It's fear of being wrong versus the machine, fear of looking slow, fear of looking like the person who doesn't get it, and fear of challenging an artifact that leadership might already have read and forwarded. So what happens? People stop challenging outputs directly. They route concerns sideways. They DM a colleague. Is it just me, or is that recap missing the main issue? They rewrite a sentence quietly instead of raising the underlying disagreement. They accept the summary but try to fix it later in the document. They delay because delay is safer than open dissent. This is how errors become durable. Because the one thing that prevents narrative drift is visible dissent at the moment the narrative is formed. When dissent goes private, the organization loses the corrective mechanism. The artifact propagates, and the people who know it's wrong assume someone else will handle it. Nobody does. Now add the identity threat. In draft-first environments, critique already feels personal because the artifact represents someone's competence. AI intensifies that because the person who posted it may have invested status into it. I produced the clean version. Challenging it isn't critiquing the tool. It's critiquing my contribution. So defensive behavior shows up fast. Teams defend outputs instead of exploring ideas. They argue about wording, not assumptions. They treat objections as delays, not as risk discovery. And because AI outputs look complete early, the organization perceives exploration as inefficiency. That's how debate suppression happens without anyone saying stop debating. It's not censorship, it's cost engineering. Make dissent feel expensive and people will self-censor. This is also why psychological safety can't be handled with slogans. The system has changed, the social incentives have changed. So leaders need to do something unfashionable. Design explicit permission to challenge the machine. Not be brave, not speak up. Design it. A simple move. Normalize the phrase. The summary is a draft, not a verdict. Say it every time. Say it until it sounds boring. Because boredom is the point. You're trying to remove the social drama from disagreeing with AI output. You're trying to make critique procedural. Another move. Require a dissent slot in the artifact itself, not a side conversation. In the recap, open questions, risks, minority view, assumptions. When dissent has a named container, speaking up stops being an act of rebellion and becomes part of the workflow. And the leadership behavior has to match the structure. If someone challenges a Copilot summary and the leader responds with irritation, the lesson is permanent. don't do that again. If the leader responds with good catch, revise the artifact, then the lesson is equally permanent. The system is editable and reality is negotiated by humans. That's what psychological safety is in architectural terms, the ability of the system to accept corrections without punishing the correction mechanism. Because AI will be wrong, sometimes subtly, sometimes socially, sometimes strategically. The only question is whether your people will tell you while it still matters. Experiential, psychological ownership, productivity up, pride ambiguous. Once psychological safety gets shaky, the next failure looks less dramatic and more efficient. Productivity goes up. Pride gets weird. Psychological ownership is the sense that this is mine, not legally, not politically, but cognitively. It's the invisible bond between a person and a piece of work that makes them care about details nobody asked for, defend quality without being told, and feel responsible for outcomes they can't fully control. Organizations depend on that bond more than they admit, because most quality isn't enforced by policy. It's enforced by people who feel ownership. Traditionally, psychological ownership comes from three pathways: control, intimate knowledge, and self-investment. Control means the person had real agency. They chose the approach, negotiated constraints, and made decisions. Intimate knowledge means they understand the work deeply enough to see what's missing. Self-investment means they paid a cognitive price, time, effort, and the discomfort of not knowing until they figured it out. AI shifts all three at once. Draft-first workflows reduce self-investment. You don't struggle through a first draft, you curate one. You don't wrestle with structure, you accept structure and adjust it. The emotional arc changes from "I built this" to "I improved this." That seems fine. But over time, it produces a specific pattern. Throughput rises and attachment declines. And attachment is what makes people do the last 10% that prevents the next incident review. There's also a quieter problem. Authorship becomes socially ambiguous. In a pre-AI world, a document had an author, a reviewer, maybe an editor. You could argue about quality because you knew who owned the thinking. In an AI-mediated world, you get mixed roles: the prompt holder, the human editor, the approver, and the person who gets blamed when it fails. Those roles rarely align, so pride becomes diluted. If a person can't confidently say, "I wrote this and I stand behind it," they also won't say, "This is wrong and I'll fix it." They'll say, "It's good enough," and ship it, because good enough is the only defensible stance when authorship is distributed and accountability is unclear. This is not a personality issue. Its system design AI also changes the social reward function. Fast drafts get praised, clean summaries get forwarded, polished decks get celebrated. The organization starts rewarding artifact quality, not reasoning quality. And people adapt. They optimize for what gets noticed: output volume and presentational coherence. Meanwhile, the work that builds real ownership, deep understanding, uncomfortable trade-offs, explicit reasoning, gets compressed out of the visible workflow. That produces a new kind of disengagement that's hard for leaders to spot. People look busy. Artifacts keep shipping. But the internal posture shifts from "I own this outcome" to "I processed this request." That is how excellence erodes, not through sabotage, but through steady replacement of authorship with participation. Here's the counterintuitive part. AI can increase perceived productivity while decreasing craftsmanship, because craftsmanship requires friction. It requires the person to feel the weight of consequences and the intimacy of details. When the work arrives pre-shaped and pre-worded, the person becomes a custodian, not a creator. Custodians keep things moving. Creators build conviction, and conviction is what holds under pressure. So what does leadership do without turning this into a moral lecture about human pride? They make ownership explicit in the places that matter. High-impact artifacts need an accountable owner, visibly named, who is responsible for the recommendation and its reasoning, even if the draft was co-authored by AI. That single design move restores the ownership pathway of control. Someone is steering, and everyone knows who it is. Second, preserve self-investment where it pays off. Not everywhere, not on low-stakes work, but on decisions that shape policy, risk posture, people outcomes, and strategic direction. Those artifacts should force humans to write the problem statement and the decision rationale in plain language, because that's where ownership is formed. Third, treat AI contribution as normal but not invisible. Invisible co-authorship destroys pride and accountability simultaneously. If the organization normalizes Copilot wrote it as a shameful secret, people will hide it, and then nobody can calibrate trust. If the organization normalizes it as disclosed tooling like using Excel, then people can still own the outcome without pretending they typed every word. That's the practical truth. AI doesn't remove the need for human ownership. It removes the default conditions that used to generate it. And if leaders don't rebuild those conditions intentionally, they won't get a workforce of empowered superworkers. They'll get a workforce of high-speed editors who don't feel the work is theirs, right up until something breaks and everyone asks, "Who approved this?" Viva Insights. Signals as insight, not surveillance. Now, leadership typically responds to all of this with the same reflex: measure it. And yes, measurement matters, but in the AI era, measurement is also a weapon. So if you don't understand what you're measuring and how people will experience it, you'll turn insight into surveillance in about 3 weeks. That distinction matters. Viva Insights sits right on that fault line. It analyzes collaboration patterns from Microsoft 365 signals, meetings, email, chats, calls, focus time, after-hours activity. It can surface trends at the individual level, the manager level, and the organizational level, usually with privacy protections like aggregation and de-identification. The intent is reasonable, show you where collaboration is degrading performance and well-being. But the system behavior is predictable. If leaders treat the dashboard as a control panel for people, people will treat the system as an adversary. So the first principle is simple. Viva Insights is not a productivity scoreboard, it's a drift detector. It detects collaboration debt, overload, fragmentation, shallow async, meeting sprawl, after-hours creep. And in an AI-mediated workplace, those patterns can get worse while output volume looks better, because Copilot can keep shipping drafts even when humans are exhausted. That's the whole problem. Throughput can mask strain. Signals make the hidden cost visible, but signals don't explain causality. If a team has high meeting hours, the dashboard can show it. It cannot tell you whether those meetings are waste, governance, crisis response, onboarding, or actual decision work. If after-hours work rises, Viva can flag it. It cannot tell you if it's a temporary surge for a launch or a structural failure in staffing or a cultural addiction to responsiveness. So the executive job is interpretation, and interpretation is human. This is where the privacy boundary is not a legal detail, it's the product. Leaders must be explicit. The purpose of these signals is to improve the system, not to punish individuals. Because the moment employees believe these metrics affect performance evaluation, you've created two outcomes. People will hide their work, and your data will get worse. The system will still show improvement. It will be lying. And this is where AI changes the stakes again. Once Copilot becomes a co-author, you can't manage collaboration by counting artifacts. You have to manage it by watching the conditions that produce coherent thinking, protected focus time, real debate, clear decision structures, and norms that keep accountability visible. Viva Insights can help you see whether those conditions exist. For example, are meetings shrinking but chat volume exploding? That often means decisions moved into async without the structure to support them. Are employees in constant interruption patterns? Meetings, notifications, context switching every few minutes? That tells you the cognitive environment is hostile to deep work, and AI will simply paper over the damage by generating good enough outputs while understanding declines. Are managers spending their week in meetings, leaving no time for coaching? That's not a wellness problem, that's a leadership throughput problem. The most dangerous leadership move is to treat these dashboards as proof that a Copilot rollout worked. Adoption and impact are not the same thing. High usage can mean value. It can also mean dependency. It can also mean people are using AI to survive the collaboration chaos you refuse to fix. So the correct posture is signals are prompts for inquiry, not verdicts. A productive pattern is to use Viva Insights to ask better questions in leadership reviews, not who is overworking. Instead, what in our operating model is producing after-hours work and what will we remove? Not why is this team meeting so much? Instead, which decisions are unclear enough that we keep relitigating them? Not why are they fragmented? Instead, where did we remove friction that was actually protecting coherence? And then there's the AI-specific layer. If the system starts generating more recaps, more summaries, more drafts, you should expect the organization's sense of progress to rise, even if decision quality is decaying. Viva's value is that it can show the mismatch. Efficiency rising, but focus time collapsing. Meeting countdown, but network fragmentation up. Outputs up, but burnout signals up. That's your early warning that you're not building excellence. You're building conditional chaos at scale. So if you're going to deploy Viva Insights in an AI era, you need one non-negotiable governance rule. Treat the data as feedback, not control. Use it to redesign work, not to police workers. Because the second you weaponize signals, people will stop being honest, and the platform will faithfully optimize you into a false sense of stability. And that's the fastest way to lose the one thing AI cannot replace: humans willing to tell you the truth. The productivity paradox. Efficiency rises while coherence drops. Now connect the dots, because this is where leaders get fooled by their own dashboards. The productivity paradox in AI-mediated work is simple. You can remove friction and still make the organization worse at deciding. You see it as faster. But what actually happened is you traded sense-making for output. Shorter meetings can mean better discipline, or they can mean the decision just moved somewhere else, usually into chat, usually without a decision structure, and usually without anyone surfacing assumptions. You didn't eliminate the work, you displaced it. Faster drafts can mean less time spent formatting and more time spent thinking, or it can mean nobody did the thinking because the artifact arrived pre-shaped and the team jumped straight to editing. Again, you didn't eliminate the work, you postponed it. Less friction can mean less bureaucracy, or it can mean less debate, less dissent, and fewer people willing to say, this is the wrong frame, that's not agility, that's fragility. Here's the uncomfortable truth. AI makes organizations feel coherent because it can generate coherence on demand. It writes the recap, it writes the plan, it writes the update, it writes the risks, it writes the next steps. And every one of those artifacts looks like progress. But coherence isn't a document property, it's a shared mental model property. Coherence is when 10 people can predict what the other 9 will do next and why, because they actually understand the constraints and the trade-offs. AI can generate a clean narrative without generating that shared understanding. That's the paradox. Your output quality goes up while your collective cognition gets thinner. You see the symptoms later, not immediately. You see rework, not because people are incompetent, but because they never aligned on meaning. You see decision reversals, not because leadership is fickle, but because the first decision was made under a false sense of consensus created by tidy summaries and polished drafts. You see alignment language everywhere. We're aligned, we're on the same page, and then 2 weeks later you realize nobody was. They were aligned on text, not on intent. This is also why AI adoption is a useless success metric by itself. High usage can mean value. It can also mean the organization is using AI to survive its own fragmentation. Copilot becomes the duct tape that keeps the artifact pipeline moving while the underlying system drifts. And drift is the real enemy here. Missing policies create obvious gaps. Drifting collaboration creates ambiguity. Ambiguity is where the organization starts paying in hidden ways. Escalations, duplicated work, passive resistance, and quiet risk accumulation. Viva Insights will show you some of the signals. Constant interruptions, shrinking focus time, after-hours creep, meeting overload that should have declined but didn't. Those are not employee problems. Those are system problems. But the more dangerous signal is one you won't see directly, the loss of shared conviction. People can't explain why the work is true. They can't defend the trade-offs. They can't tell you what would change their mind. They can only forward the artifact. That is not operational excellence. That is administrative motion. So the executive interpretation needs to be precise. Efficiency is not the same thing as effectiveness. Efficiency is we produced the artifact faster. Effectiveness is we made a better decision and reduced future rework. AI boosts efficiency by default. It only boosts effectiveness if you deliberately preserve the human work that creates coherence, framing, debate, and accountability. This is why the leadership job isn't to ask, how do we use Copilot more? It's to ask, where does speed create illusions in our operating model? Because if you don't answer that, you'll do the normal corporate thing. Celebrate the visible wins and ignore the invisible losses until they show up as an incident, a failed initiative, or a workforce that's technically productive and spiritually disengaged. And then you'll say, we need better change management. No. You need intentional friction in the right places, on purpose, as a design feature. Design principle. Intentional friction keeps humans irreplaceable. So here's the design move that stops all of this from becoming a slow organizational collapse disguised as AI transformation. Intentional friction, not bureaucracy, not committees, not more templates. Friction as a deliberate checkpoint that forces human judgment to show up where it matters. Because the reality is simple. If you remove all friction from knowledge work, you don't get excellence. You get autopilot, and autopilot is fine until the environment changes, the data drifts, or the stakes spike. Then you discover what you actually built, a fast system with no steering. Intentional friction is the steering. It's the set of points where the system refuses to proceed without a human doing the hard cognitive work, framing, trade-offs, and ownership. This is where leaders need to stop romanticizing speed and start treating it as a risk factor. Speed compresses time for disagreement. Speed compresses time for sense-making. Speed compresses the space where someone can say, wait, are we sure we're solving the right problem? And in AI-mediated workflows, that space is the only thing preventing a coherent draft from becoming a coherent mistake. So friction has a definition in this context. A purposeful delay inserted at decision-critical moments to preserve epistemic agency. That means friction is not evenly distributed. You don't add it everywhere. You don't slow down low-stakes work. You don't make people defend every email. That's how you turn a good idea into performative governance. You reserve friction for high-impact work, policy, strategy, risk posture, people decisions, external messaging, and anything that becomes precedent. Everything else stays fast. Because the point isn't to protect humans from work. The point is to protect the organization from unowned decisions. Here's what most people miss. The irreplaceable human isn't the person who can write. It's the person who can be held accountable for a claim. AI can generate an answer. Only a human can own the consequences. So your friction points should line up with consequence. And there are 3 friction mechanisms that work because they're structural, not motivational. First, the framing gate. No AI draft becomes the working artifact until the problem statement exists in human language. 2 paragraphs. What decision is being made, what constraints are real, and what failure looks like. Not what success looks like, failure. Because that forces risk appetite into the open. If the team can't write that, they don't understand the work yet. Second, the alternatives requirement. Every consequential recommendation must include at least 2 plausible alternatives with a sentence on why each was rejected, not 10 alternatives. 2. The goal is to prevent first coherent story wins from becoming the operating system. This is how you keep debate alive without turning every meeting into philosophy. Third, the reasoning trace, not chain of thought from the model. Human reasoning trace assumptions, inputs, and the one thing that would change the decision. If this goes wrong, the postmortem shouldn't be the AI hallucinated. It should be, we accepted a claim without validating the assumptions. That's the accountability loop. Now notice what this friction does. It doesn't block AI, it disciplines AI. It preserves the human contribution that AI cannot replicate. Epistemic responsibility. And that's why it keeps humans irreplaceable, because the organization becomes explicit about where the human role is mandatory, not as a vibe, as a control. This is also where Viva Insights and Work IQ become complementary rather than distracting. Work IQ improves relevance. Great, that makes the drafts better. Viva Insights shows you where the system is overloading humans so badly that they'll accept anything that looks finished. That's the environment your friction has to protect against. If people are interrupted constantly, they will skip the friction unless it's enforced by workflow. So the leadership job is to insert friction where it can't be socially bypassed. Put it in the artifact, not in the meeting. Make it a required section in the decision memo. Make it a required field in the project template. Make it the norm that a recap without assumptions is incomplete, because humans don't consistently do hard things due to inspiration. They do them because the system expects it. And if you design it correctly, something counterintuitive happens. You get faster over time. Not because you moved faster in the moment, but because you cut rework, decision reversals, and downstream confusion. You trade a small intentional delay upfront for a large reduction in entropy later. That is what excellence looks like in an AI-mediated workplace. Not more output, more owned decisions. Case study, productivity went up, confidence went sideways. A case makes this real, because otherwise it sounds like philosophy, and executives don't fund philosophy. This was a knowledge-heavy team. Strategy, policy, stakeholder comms, the kind of work where the output looks like words, but the real product is judgment. They adopted Copilot in the predictable way. Meeting recaps, drafting, summarizing long threads, and accelerating first versions of briefs. Nobody tried to automate the business. They just tried to save time. And they did. Time to first draft dropped sharply. Work that used to take half a day to get into a presentable shape now landed in minutes as something editable. Meetings got shorter because everyone assumed the recap would catch what they missed. People felt relief. Leaders saw movement. The artifact pipeline looked cleaner. Then the side effects showed up quietly as downstream cost. The first symptom wasn't errors. It was weaker debate. The team stopped arguing early because the AI output arrived early. And once a coherent narrative exists, the social pressure is to edit, not to reframe. So conversations shifted from what are we really trying to decide into can we tighten this language, from what's the risk we're accepting to does this read well? That's where confidence went sideways. Not confidence in Copilot, confidence in the work. People started shipping things they couldn't fully defend. When asked, why are we recommending this? The answer became a paraphrase of the draft, not a reconstruction of the reasoning. Nobody was lying, nobody was being lazy. They were behaving exactly how a draft-first system trains humans to behave. Accept, polish, forward. The second symptom was summary dependence. Leaders started reading recaps instead of attending, which is fine, until the recap becomes the official memory. The recap got forwarded. It became what we decided even when it wasn't. And because the recap looked neutral and complete, challenging it felt like challenging reality. So dissent moved to side chats. People tried to fix misunderstandings later, in private, after momentum already moved. The third symptom was ownership ambiguity. In the old workflow, one person wrote the memo and everyone knew where the thinking lived. In the new workflow, the memo started as AI, got edited by 2 people, approved by a third, and then shipped. When it was good, credit dispersed. When it was wrong, accountability became a group shrug. Not because anyone avoided responsibility, but because the system diluted authorship so effectively that nobody could point to the moment where the organization actually decided. That dilution matters because high-quality work depends on someone feeling, this is mine. Over a few weeks, the team's output volume went up, but their shared mental model got thinner. They began to see rework. Stakeholders asked the same questions repeatedly. Decisions got revisited, not because the plan changed, but because the original rationale never existed in a way the team could reproduce under pressure. So they intervened, not by banning Copilot, by installing friction in exactly 3 places. First, they separated generation from approval. Copilot could draft anything, but nothing moved forward until a named human owner rewrote the problem statement and the decision rationale in plain language from scratch. 2 short paragraphs. If the owner couldn't do that, they weren't ready to ship. This wasn't punishment, it was a diagnostic, comprehension check before momentum. Second, they required alternatives. Every recommendation needed two plausible paths with explicit trade-offs, not a long list. 2. This forced the team to demonstrate they understood the decision space instead of accepting the first narrative that compiled cleanly. Third, they created a lightweight decision log, not meeting minutes, decisions, what was decided by whom, what assumptions it depended on, and what would change it. That last part mattered more than people expected, because it reintroduced epistemic agency. Here's what we believe, and here's what could falsify it. The result wasn't slower work, it was fewer reversals. The team still used Copilot heavily, they just stopped treating AI outputs as defaults. Drafts stayed cheap, judgment became visible again. And once judgment was visible, confidence came back because people could explain their own decisions without leaning on the machine as a shield. That's the lesson. Productivity gains are real, but unless you redesign for ownership, you'll trade time saved for coherence lost, and you'll pay it back with interest. Leadership rule: make AI visible where accountability matters. So the case study lands on the real lesson. You don't need less AI. You need less invisible AI, because invisible co-authorship creates the perfect corporate escape hatch. Output with no author, decisions with no owner, and a trail of "the system said" when someone asks what happened. That's why the leadership rule is blunt. Make AI visible where accountability matters, not in every trivial email, not in every internal chat, but in the artifacts that carry consequence. Strategy decks, policy changes, customer-facing statements, performance messaging, incident communications, risk decisions, and anything that becomes precedent. If the organization can't see where AI participated, it can't calibrate trust, it can't audit reasoning, and it can't assign responsibility without turning every post-mortem into a blame seance. Visibility is governance, it's not etiquette. Start with the first ban. Ban the invisible co-author. If a key artifact was materially generated by Copilot or another model, the artifact needs a simple disclosure line. Not performative, not apologetic, just factual. Draft generated with AI assistance, reviewed and approved by human owner. That single sentence does two things at once. It removes shame and it fixes accountability. Because now everyone knows who owns the decision. Next, separate generation from approval. AI can generate. Humans approve. That sounds obvious until you look at how most teams behave. They treat the first coherent draft as the starting point, and then they treat editing as the same thing as thinking. It isn't. Editing is post-processing, approval is responsibility. Leaders need to make that separation explicit in the workflow. A simple pattern: one person can use AI to generate options, but a different person or a different role must sign off. That creates distance from the fluency effect. It reintroduces skepticism. It makes it harder for the AI suggested to become a veto. And if you're in a smaller team where separation isn't possible, then enforce role separation in time. Draft today, approve tomorrow. Sleep is an underrated governance control. Decision fatigue creates automation bias. Teams accept what looks finished when they're tired. Then, preserve reasoning, not just conclusions. The artifact that gets forwarded around your company is rarely the raw evidence. It's the summary. So if you let the summary omit the reasoning, you will eventually lose the ability to defend decisions under pressure. And pressure is where your controls get tested. The fix isn't more documentation, it's structured documentation. For high-stakes work, require 3 fields in the artifact itself: what we believe, what we're assuming, what would change our mind. That last one is the agency preservative. It forces humans to articulate falsifiers. It prevents the organization from turning AI output into scripture. And it gives you a real audit trail later. Not just what the machine wrote, but what the humans committed to. Now the weird part: visibility also protects psychological safety. When AI contribution is hidden, challenging the output becomes personal. The person who posted the draft feels attacked. The team avoids conflict. Errors persist. But when AI contribution is explicit, critique becomes critique of a tool. The social temperature drops. People will say, "This synthesis missed the risk," without implying you're incompetent. That distinction keeps Speak Up alive. And it also fixes ownership. Humans don't need to pretend they typed every word to feel pride. They need to know the work is theirs in outcome and reasoning. Visibility makes that possible. Yes, the draft was co-authored. The decision is still mine. Finally, define the accountable owner upfront. Every consequential artifact needs one person whose name is attached to the decision, not just the document, not the team, not we, a human. This isn't about hero culture. It's about avoiding the default state of modern organizations: distributed responsibility, concentrated blame. If you don't assign ownership, the system will assign it later, during an incident, and it will be unfair. So the leadership rule can be summarized like a control plane principle. If accountability matters, opacity is an outage. Make AI contribution visible, make human approval explicit, make reasoning durable, and then you can let the machine run fast without turning your organization into a high-throughput generator of plausible, unowned decisions. Because AI doesn't remove accountability, it just gives people new ways to hide from it. Weekly decision framework: what must remain human versus co-authored. So now you have the rule: make AI visible where accountability matters. But rules decay unless you operationalize them. This is where leaders usually reach for policy. And policies are great at creating PDFs. They're not great at changing behavior inside teams at 4:47 p.m. What works is a weekly decision framework, a simple lens that leaders apply out loud, repeatedly, until the organization starts using it as reflex. Because the real failure mode isn't AI misuse. It's that everything becomes co-authored by default, including the work that should never be co-authored without visible human ownership. So here's the framework, 3 questions, asked in this order, every week, in leadership staff, in project reviews, in people decisions, in incident reviews. First question, does this require judgment and accountability? Not does it require intelligence, judgment, trade-offs, risk tolerance, accepting consequences. If the answer is yes, AI can assist, but the human must be named, and the human must be able to restate the reasoning without leaning on Copilot said, because the system can generate recommendations. It cannot carry liability. It cannot take the call from legal. It cannot look someone in the eye after a decision lands badly. Second question, does this shape trust, culture, or power dynamics? This is the one leaders skip because it feels soft. It isn't. Anything that changes how people feel about fairness, voice recognition, or belonging is a high-stakes decision, even if it looks like just communication, a performance message, a reorg announcement, a policy clarification, a quick summary after a tense meeting. If the outcome changes social reality, you don't let the machine become the narrator without explicit human intent. So again, AI assists, humans decide, humans own the narrative. Third question, would removing human authorship reduce learning or debate? This is the epistemic agency test. If the process becomes draft arrives, edit, ship, and nobody had to build a model of the problem, you will get speed in the moment and fragility later. That is not a trade you want on strategy, on risk, or on anything that will be repeated as precedent. So if, yes, you force a human to do the cognitive work that produces understanding, frame the problem, propose alternatives, and write a reasoning trace. Now translate this into a decision. If any answer is yes, the work is in the human-required lane, not human only. Human-required AI can do the first draft, AI can summarize inputs, AI can generate options. But you enforce 3 controls: visible AI contribution, named accountable owner, and preserved reasoning. If all 3 answers are no, then you let it be co-authored aggressively. Because you should not waste human cognition on low-stakes artifacts. Let the machine compress it, let it write it, let it schedule it, let it summarize it, let it move the work forward. That's the point of AI. Offload the trivial so the human can be concentrated where consequences live. Now make it practical. Run this framework once a week against the work your leadership team is about to ship. Strategy decks, yes. Judgment and power dynamics. Human required. Policy changes, yes. Trust and precedent. Human required. Performance messaging, yes. Culture and psychological safety, human required. Incident communications, yes. Risk and accountability, human required. Project status emails about low-risk delivery work, probably no. Co-authored. Meeting recap for an informational sync, probably no. Co-authored. But here's the twist. The framework doesn't just classify tasks. It forces you to see where your operating model is leaking accountability. If your leaders can't answer these questions quickly, you don't have an AI adoption problem. You have a decision architecture problem. Because high-performing organizations already know which work is consequential. They already know where debate matters. They already know which narratives shape culture. AI just makes the cost of ignoring that truth visible. So the weekly ritual is simple. Pick 5 artifacts, run the 3 questions, and adjust the workflow accordingly. And do it publicly. Say, this one stays fast. Say, this one requires a decision log. Say, this one needs named ownership. Say, this one needs alternatives. You're teaching the organization that excellence is designed, not hoped for. And over time, the organization stops treating Copilot as a feature set. It starts treating it as a participant that must be governed. That's the whole shift. Not tool adoption. Decision hygiene under acceleration. Collaboration norms for the AI era, guardrails without bureaucracy. Now take the framework and turn it into something the organization can actually live with, because norms are the only thing that scale faster than entropy. And no, this doesn't mean a 27-page Copilot policy that nobody reads. It means a few guardrails that show up in the work itself: meetings, chat, and documents. The surface is where drift happens. Start with meetings because AI has turned meetings into content factories. The meeting recap is not truth, it's input. So the norm is, every recap must point to a decision log entry or explicitly state no decisions made. That sounds pedantic until you realize how often we talked about it gets mistaken for we decided. If you want coherence, decisions must be named, owned, and retrievable. Second meeting norm, the assumptions line. If a recap contains recommendations, it must contain at least one stated assumption, not 5. 1. The goal is to remind everyone that every clean summary sits on hidden premises. Bring one premise into daylight and you keep the organization from treating a synthesis as a verdict. Now chat, because chat is where debate goes to die. The AI era pushes teams' threads toward confirmation. Looks good. Approved. Ship it. You don't fix that by begging people to ask more questions. You fix it by designing space for dissent. So the chat norm is a dissent slot. One message, early in the thread, that invites counterviews. Something as simple as, before we align, what's the strongest reason this could be wrong? If nobody answers, fine, but the prompt exists, and that changes the social cost of speaking up. Then add a second chat norm, the two alternatives rule for proposals. If someone posts a recommendation that will drive action, they must include two plausible options, even if one is do nothing. It blocks the first coherent draft from winning by default. It also forces the poster to demonstrate that they explored the space rather than adopting the first AI-shaped narrative. Now documents, because documents are where accountability lives or dies. The doc norm is visible authorship and visible ownership. If AI materially contributed, disclose it in one line. If the doc carries consequence, name the accountable human owner at the top. And then enforce the one section that keeps humans irreplaceable. Reasoning. A standard decision appendix. What we decided, why, assumptions, and what would change our mind. Not a novel, a few bullets. You're not documenting for compliance. You're documenting so the organization can reconstruct its own thinking later, under pressure, without relying on Copilot's memory as the source of truth. And for work graph, work IQ specifically, treat discoverability as a governance surface, not an IT optimization. Canon matters, location matters, linking matters. If work lives in 10 places, the graph will tell 10 inconsistent stories. So the norm is one canonical location for the plan, one canonical location for the decision log, and one canonical place for risks. Not because SharePoint is holy, because retrieval systems punish fragmentation. Now the last norm is leadership behavior, because everything else collapses without it. Reward intelligent disagreement. Not performative contrarianism, intelligent disagreement, alternative framing, surfaced risks, explicit trade-offs, and punish silence by default. Not by shaming people, but by refusing to accept artifacts that contain no assumptions, no alternatives, and no accountable owner. That's what designing for excellence actually means. The system refuses to move forward without visible human judgment where it matters. These norms aren't bureaucracy, they're entropy controls. Because the platform will keep accelerating, Copilot will keep drafting, Work IQ will keep ranking, Viva Insights will keep surfacing signals. None of that slows down. So you either install small, intentional constraints now, or you accept conditional chaos later, fast outputs, plausible summaries, and unowned decisions that drift until something breaks. Conclusion. The question leaders can't outsource. AI doesn't make humans obsolete. It makes human judgment, context interpretation, and accountability the only scarce resource that still matters. If you want this to work at scale, subscribe to CTS and become a member on Spreaker to get the podcast ad-free and keep going with the full episode where we break down the operating model in detail. Because the real leadership question isn't how do we deploy Copilot? It's this. What kind of collaborators are you designing your organization to produce?